My name is Walter Hale. Grab your coffee or your snacks right now, because you are not going to want to pause this one. I am 51 years old. I have spent the last 30 years of my life working land in central Kentucky, and I am the kind of man who measures a season by the weather rather than the calendar. 12 years ago, my father handed me the keys to the family farm and told me, in front of my brother and sister, that the land would belong to whichever one of us was still standing on it when he passed. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who worked it through droughts and frozen winters, and a flood that took half a season's tobacco crop in a single night. And when my father died, my brother and sister stood in a lawyer's office and told me, with straight faces, that I had no claim to anything at all. Welcome back to the channel, where quiet, hardworking people get the truth they earned, even when everyone around them swore they never would. If you believe patience eventually gets its due, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed. Let me back up 12 years, because none of what happened in that lawyer's office makes sense without it. My father's name was Earl Hale, and he was born on the same 80 acres outside a small town in Boyle County, Kentucky, that I would eventually spend most of my adult life working. The Hale family had owned that land since the early 1950s, when my grandfather, a man I never met, bought it cheap after the war with money he had saved working in a tobacco warehouse, and built a modest farmhouse on a rise overlooking what would eventually become some of the most productive bottomland in that part of the county. By the time I was born, the third of 3 children and the only son, the farm had been in the family for over 2 decades, and it occupied a particular place in my father's understanding of who we were as a family. It was not just property. It was, in his mind, a kind of inheritance of character. Proof that a man who worked hard enough and held onto something long enough could build a legacy that outlasted him. My sister Donna was 6 years older than me, and my brother Curtis was 4 years older. Growing up, the 3 of us had very different relationships to the farm, and I think those differences set the stage for everything that happened decades later, though none of us could have known it at the time. Donna left for Lexington the day after she graduated high school, determined to build a life that had nothing to do with dirt under her fingernails or the particular exhaustion of a farming life. And I never once held that against her. She built a good career as a paralegal, married a man who worked in insurance, and visited the farm maybe twice a year, holidays mostly, always slightly overdressed for the occasion in a way that made my father chuckle affectionately when she was not in earshot. Curtis stayed in the area longer than Donna did, working various jobs in town, but he never had much interest in the actual labor of farming either. He liked the idea of the land, the status of being a Hale from Hale land, but he did not like getting up before sunrise, or fixing fence line in July heat, or staying up half the night during calving season. I was the one who liked all of that, strange as it might sound to people who have never done it. I liked the rhythm of it, the honesty of work where the results were visible and immediate, the particular satisfaction of watching a field you had worked yourself turn green in the spring. I want to tell you about my mother before I go further, because her absence shaped this story in ways that took me years to fully understand. My mother, Ruth Hale, passed away when I was 9 years old, from a cancer that moved faster than anyone expected, and her death left my father raising 3 children largely alone on a working farm, a responsibility that I think hardened something in him permanently. Donna, who was 15 at the time, stepped into a caretaking role for Curtis and me's that was not really hers to carry, and I think some of her eagerness to leave the farm the moment she turned 18 had as much to do with escaping that early, unwanted responsibility as it did with any genuine dislike of farm life itself. Curtis, who was 13 when our mother died, became quieter in the years afterward, more prone to disappearing into town with friends rather than staying close to the house, a pattern my father noticed and worried about, but never quite knew how to address. I was only 9, and I do not remember those years with the same clarity my older siblings carry. But I remember my father working harder than ever in the months after her death, as though physical exhaustion was the only language available to him for grief. And I remember following him out into the fields, simply because I did not want to be in the house without her in it. I think this early history matters because it explains, at least in part, why my father came to value the farm the way he did, and why he eventually came to value my presence on it the way he did as well. The land had been there before my mother died, and it was still there after, steady and unchanging in a way that nothing else in our family quite was during those years. My father once told me, when I was in my 20s, that working the land had been the only thing that made sense to him in the months after my mother's funeral, the only task that did not require him to feel anything beyond what his body could physically accomplish in a given day. I think, looking back, that my own attachment to the farm grew out of something similar, though I did not understand it that way at the time. I simply knew that I felt most like myself when I was out in those fields, and that feeling never left me. Not through my teenage years, not through the brief period I spent away in Louisville, not through any of the 3 decades that followed. I want to spend some time describing what the actual work looked like, because I think people who have not lived this kind of life sometimes do not understand the scale of what gets built through years of unglamorous labor. And I think that understanding matters for everything that happened later. By the time I was 22, I had moved back to the farm full-time after a brief stint working construction in Louisville that taught me mostly that I missed the land more than I had expected to. My father was 61 years old at that point, and though he was still strong, the work was beginning to take a visible toll on his body, the particular wear of decades spent bending and lifting and standing in weather that did not care how a man felt. I took over the bulk of the physical labor within 2 years of moving back. I want to be specific about what that meant, because the specifics matter. I managed the cattle herd, which over the years grew from around 40 head to nearly 90, requiring daily attention, regardless of weather, regardless of holidays, regardless of whether I felt well. I maintained the equipment, learning to repair tractors and balers, and the irrigation system myself, rather than paying for service calls we could not always afford. I managed the tobacco allotment in the years before the federal buyout changed how that worked, and afterward I helped transition a portion of the land towards soybeans and corn, work that required me to teach myself new agricultural techniques through county extension courses and a great deal of trial and error. I want to tell you about one particular year, the year I was 26, because I think it captures something important about the 12 years that followed. We had an unusually wet spring that year, the kind of spring that turns bottomland into something closer to swamp, and I spent 3 straight weeks getting up before 4 in the morning to check on a herd that kept finding new ways to get stuck in mud or tangled in downed fence line from the storms. My father, who was 65 that year, and increasingly limited by a bad hip, could offer guidance and decades of accumulated knowledge, which was valuable, but he could no longer do the physical work that knowledge required. I remember one particular morning, somewhere around 4:30, pulling a calf out of a mud-choked drainage ditch in driving rain, alone, because there was no one else to call, and standing afterward in the downpour with my arms shaking from exhaustion, looking at that calf breathing and alive, and feeling something that I can only describe as a strange, fierce pride that had nothing to do with anyone watching or praising me. That feeling, more than any single conversation or promise, is what kept me on that land for the next 2.5 decades. Stay with me. Because what happened around the kitchen table when I was 39 years old is the moment that would eventually matter more than any other single conversation in this entire story. It was a Sunday evening in late October, the kind of crisp fall evening that smells like wood smoke and cut hay, and Donna and Curtis had both come for dinner, a rare occasion when all 3 of us were under the same roof at the same time along with our father. My father had recently turned 73, and though he was still sharp and engaged, he had begun in the previous year to speak more openly about what would happen to the farm after he was gone, conversations that had clearly been weighing on him as his own mortality became less abstract. After dinner, as we sat around that same kitchen table where I had eaten thousands of meals over the course of my life, my father cleared his throat in a way that told all 3 of us he had something prepared to say. He told us, that evening, that he had been thinking a great deal about the future of the farm, and that he wanted to be clear with all three of us about his intentions, rather than leaving things ambiguous the way some families did. Ambiguity that he had seen tear other families in the county apart after a parent's death. He said the farm would go to whichever one of his children was still working it, still living on it, still committed to it, when he passed. He looked directly at me when he said this, though he was careful in that moment to phrase it in a way that technically left the door open to any of us. He said this was not about favoritism. He said it was about stewardship, about the land going to whoever had proven, through their actual life and actual labor, that they were the one meant to carry it forward. Donna nodded along politely, clearly uninterested in the proposition, given the life she had already built in Lexington. Curtis was quieter, and I remember catching a flicker of something on his face that I could not quite read at the time, something between resentment and resignation. Though he said nothing that evening to suggest he intended to contest the arrangement. I did not ask my father to put anything in writing that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters for understanding what happened later. I trusted him. He was my father, and he had just told me, in front of my siblings, what his intentions were, and at 39 years old, after 17 years of already having built my entire adult life around that farm, it did not occur to me that I needed a formal document to protect what felt, in that moment, like an obvious and settled truth. I think, looking back, this was perhaps the only real mistake I made in this entire story, and even now I am not entirely sure a different choice would have changed what eventually happened, given everything else that unfolded. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Curtis in the parking lot outside that same house, later that same evening, because I think it is the earliest sign I can point to of what was actually brewing beneath his outwardly calm reaction at the dinner table. Curtis walked me out to my truck after Donna had already left, and he stood there for a moment in the cold October air, his hands in his jacket pockets, and he said, in a tone that I read at the time as simple resignation, rather than anything sharper, that it made sense, that everybody knew the farm was really mine already in every way that mattered. I told him I appreciated him saying that. He nodded and said goodnight and walked back toward his car. And I did not think much more about that exchange for years afterward. It was only much later, after everything that happened in that lawyer's office, that I came to understand the particular weight behind the phrase he had used, that everybody knew as though he had already, even then, begun building a quiet internal case for himself, a narrative in which the farm being mine in practice did not necessarily mean it should be mine on paper, a distinction that I do not think occurred to me at all that night, but that I believe, looking back, had already taken root in him. The following 12 years continued largely as the previous 17 had, except that my father's health declined steadily, and the responsibility for the farm's daily operation, which had already rested mostly on my shoulders, became entirely mine. I married during this period to a woman named Susan, a school teacher in the nearby town, who understood from the very beginning of our relationship what marrying into farm life meant. The early mornings, the unpredictable income tied to weather and markets, the way the work never fully stopped even on holidays. Susan and I built a small house on the far end of the property, close enough to my father's farmhouse that I could check on him easily as his health worsened, far enough to have our own life. We had 2 children during those years, a son named Eli and a daughter named Grace, and I raised them on that land the way I had been raised, teaching them to ride before they could properly walk, teaching them the names of every field and which ones flooded first in heavy rain, watching them grow up with the same deep, wordless attachment to that place that I had carried since I was a boy, following my own grieving father out into the rows after my mother's death. I want to tell you about a specific Thanksgivings when I was about 44, because I think it illustrates the slow widening of distance between Curtis and me during this period, a distance that I sensed but did not fully understand the cause of at the time. Curtis had brought a girlfriend to dinner that year, a woman he had been seeing for several months, and at some point over the meal, in what I assumed was simply an attempt to make conversation, She asked who would eventually inherit the farm. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence at the table. My father, somewhat awkwardly, said that arrangements had already been discussed within the family. Curtis said nothing at all, his jaw tight, and changed the subject quickly to something about the football game playing on the television in the next room. I noticed the tension but attributed it, at the time, to simple awkwardness around a sensitive topic raised by someone outside the family, rather than recognizing it as a sign of something that had been quietly hardening in Curtis for years. My father's hip replacement, when he was 76, marked a significant turning point in his physical capacity. He never fully recovered the mobility he'd had before the surgery, and from that point forward, his role on the farm became almost entirely advisory. Sitting on the porch some mornings watching me work the lower field, offering suggestions through the kitchen window. But no longer capable of the physical labor that had once defined his own relationship to that land. I did not resent this shift. I want to be clear about that. I loved my father, and I considered caring for him during those years, alongside running the farm, simply part of what it meant to be his son. I drove him to medical appointments in Danville. I managed his medications when his memory began, in his final 2 years, to show small but noticeable gaps. I handled increasingly complex financial decisions related to the farm's operation, decisions my father had once made entirely himself, but gradually, naturally, came to defer to me as his trust in my judgment deepened. Donna visited occasionally during these years, usually for holidays, always warm but always clearly an outsider to the daily rhythm of the place. Curtis visited less frequently as the years went on, and when he did visit, I noticed a particular tension in him that I attributed, at the time, simply to the discomfort some people feel around a life so different from their own. I did not know during those years that Curtis had been having a series of private conversations with my father that I was not part of, conversations that would eventually matter enormously, conversations I would only learn the full content of much later, after everything had already unfolded. What happened next, I could not have predicted. Not even close. My father passed away 3 years ago in early March, at the age of 88, peacefully, in the farmhouse he had lived in for nearly his entire life, with Susan and me both present in his final hours. I want to tell you that the period immediately following his death was simply about grief, and for the first several weeks, it largely was. Donna and Curtis both came for the funeral, and the 3 of us for those few days fell into an easier rhythm with each other than we had managed in years, united by genuine shared loss. I remember thinking during those days that whatever distance had grown between my siblings and me over the decades might finally begin to close. Now that we had both lost the man who had, in his own way, been the center holding all of us together. That feeling did not survive the reading of the will. The will reading took place at a law office in Danville, 3 weeks after the funeral, with all 3 of us present, along with my father's longtime attorney, a man named Robert Pruitt, who had handled my father's legal affairs for over 20 years. I sat in that office expecting a formality, a confirmation of what my father had told us at that kitchen table, 12 years earlier. What I had quietly continued to believe was the settled and obvious arrangement given everything that had happened in the intervening years. What I heard instead, as Robert Pruitt read through the document, in his careful, measured voice, was that the farm, all 80 acres along with the farmhouse and the outbuildings, was to be divided equally among the 3 of us, with no special provision whatsoever acknowledging the decades I had spent living on and working that land. I sat very still in that office. I did not say anything immediately. I want you to understand that my first reaction was not anger but a kind of confused disbelief, the sense that I must have misheard something, that there must be some additional document, some addendum, that would clarify what I had just heard. I asked Robert Pruitt directly whether there was any provision addressing my role in managing and working the farm over the previous decades. He told me, somewhat apologetically, that the will as written made no such distinction, that it simply divided the property equally among the 3 named beneficiaries. I looked at Curtis when I heard this, and I saw, on his face, an expression that told me everything I needed to know. An expression of careful, practiced neutrality that did not match the genuine surprise I would have expected from someone hearing this division for the first time. I asked him directly, right there in that office, whether he had known about this arrangement before today. There was a long pause. And then Curtis said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound reasonable, that our father had updated his will about 4 years earlier, that he and our father had discussed the farm at length during that period, and that our father had ultimately decided that equal division was the fairest approach for all 3 of his children, regardless of who happened to be living on the property at the time of his death. I want to tell you what that moment felt like, sitting in that office, hearing my own brother explain, with calm confidence, why 29 years of my labor, my daily presence, my care for our aging father, the literal blood and exhaustion and sacrifice I had poured into that land, should count for nothing in how it was ultimately divided. Donna, beside me, looked uncomfortable, but said nothing in that initial moment, which told me she had likely known something as well, even if she had not been as actively involved as Curtis apparently had been. I did not raise my voice in that office. I want you to understand that about me, the same way I would want you to understand it about anyone who has ever had to absorb devastating news while maintaining some basic dignity in front of people who are watching to see how you react. I asked Robert Pruitt for a copy of the will and any related documentation, thanked him for his time, and left that office without saying another word to my siblings. I drove the 40 minutes back to the farm in complete silence, and when I arrived, I sat in my truck in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside and explain to Susan what had happened. I am going to tell you about the months that followed, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, the slow process of trying to understand what had actually happened and what, if anything, could be done about it. Susan was the one who first suggested I speak with an attorney of my own, separate from Robert Pruitt, who, however professional and well-meaning he had been in that initial meeting, represented the estate as a whole rather than my individual interests. I resisted this idea initially, partly out of exhaustion and grief, and partly out of a stubborn reluctance to turn a family matter into something that felt like outright legal warfare against my own siblings. I remember telling Susan, in the kitchen one night about a week after the will reading, that I did not want to become the kind of person who sued his own brother. That something about the idea felt like a betrayal of everything our father had taught me about handling disagreements within the family quietly and directly. Susan, who is a far more practical person than I am in these matters, told me gently that there was a difference between handling something quietly and simply allowing myself to be erased from a life I had spent 3 decades building, and that our own children, Eli and Grace, deserved a father who would stand up for what was right, rather than one who let exhaustion and grief make the decision for him. It took me almost 3 weeks after that conversation to actually call an attorney, 3 weeks during which I continued working the farm exactly as I always had, feeding cattle in the gray early mornings, repairing a section of fence that had come down in a windstorm, all while carrying a low, constant hum of dread about what Curtis might do next, whether he would simply put the property up for sale without my consent, whether I would arrive home one day to find a real estate sign planted in the front yard of the only house I had ever truly belonged to. I met with an attorney named Sandra Voss, a woman who practiced in Danville and had handled a number of agricultural inheritance disputes over her career, the kind of cases that come up more often than people might expect in farming communities where land has been worked by one family member while legally owned by another. I sat in her office and told her the entire history, the kitchen table conversation. 12 years earlier, the decades of labor, the way my father's trust in my judgment had grown over the years even as his own physical capacity declined, the financial decisions I had increasingly made on his behalf. Sandra listened carefully, taking notes, and then explained something to me that I had not previously understood, a legal concept she called promissory estoppel, along with a related set of principles sometimes applied in family farm inheritance disputes, both of which centered on a similar idea that when a parent makes a clear promise about future inheritance, and a child reasonably relies on that promise to their own detriment, continuing to invest years of labor and foregoing other opportunities specifically because of that promise. Courts in certain circumstances have been willing to enforce some version of the original promise, even when a later will appears to contradict it. Sandra was careful, in that first meeting and several that followed over the next month, to manage my expectations honestly rather than offering false comfort. She told me these cases were genuinely difficult to win, that courts were generally reluctant to override a clearly executed later will, and that I needed to understand, going in, that there was a real possibility I would ultimately lose this fight, despite everything I had built. I remember sitting across from her desk after hearing this, feeling a kind of cold settle into my chest that I had not fully expected. The realization that 30 years of my life might genuinely not be enough, on their own, to secure what I had always believed was simply mine by every reasonable measure of fairness. She asked me a series of careful questions over that first meetings and several that followed. Had I ever turned down other employment opportunities specifically because of the farm? Had I made financial contributions to the property that exceeded what a typical hired manager might be compensated for? Had my father, in any written form, ever acknowledged the arrangement, even informally, in a letter or a card or any document that existed outside of that single kitchen table conversation 12 years earlier? I want to tell you honestly that as Sandra worked through this list of questions, my confidence began to falter in a way I had not anticipated. I could answer the first two questions clearly, yes. I had turned down at least 2 solid job offers over the years specifically because leaving the farm was never something I seriously considered. And yes, I had invested significant personal savings into equipment and improvements that a hired manager would have had no reason to fund out of his own pocket. But the third question, about written acknowledgement, left me uncertain. I told Sandra honestly that I did not know of anything beyond my own memory of that single dinner conversation, and I watched her expression carefully as I said it, trying to read how much that uncertainty might matter. I want to tell you about the weeks I spent searching for exactly that kind of evidence, because this period, more than any other, taught me something about the strange way that ordinary life sometimes quietly documents itself without anyone intending it to. I went through boxes of old farm records stored in the equipment shed, financial documents going back decades, looking for anything that might support what Sandra needed. Some evenings I would come in from a full day of work, eat dinner quickly with Susan and the kids, and then spend 2 or 3 more hours in that dusty equipment shed under a single bare bulb, going through file boxes that had not been opened in years, my eyes burning with exhaustion, my back aching from a day already spent doing physical labor, searching through receipts and old letters and tax documents for anything that might matter. There were nights during that period when I genuinely doubted whether any of it would amount to enough. When I sat alone in that shed with dust, in the beam of that single light, and felt a despair that I had not allowed myself to feel even in the initial shock of the will reading itself, a despair that came from beginning to truly understand how fragile an entire life's worth of unwritten trust could turn out to be. I found tax records showing that for the previous 15 years, I had reported the farm income on my own returns, structuring our finances in a way that assumed clear and ongoing ownership responsibility rather than the arrangement of a hired hand working someone else's property. I found receipts for major equipment purchases I had personally financed, investments I would never have reasonably made in a property I did not expect to eventually own. I found in an old filing cabinet in my father's study a series of letters my father had written to his own brother, my uncle, over the years, letters my uncle had returned to our family after his own passing, in which my father, writing privately and with no awareness that anyone else would ever read these words, referred more than once to the farm as something that would, in his words, stay with Walter and his family, language that, while not a formal legal document, painted a clear and consistent picture of his stated intentions over many years. I remember the particular feeling of finding that first letter, Sitting on the floor of my father's old study with dust motes turning in the afternoon light from the window, reading my father's handwriting and hearing his voice so clearly in those words that I had to set the letter down for a moment before I could keep reading. The most significant piece of evidence, however, came from somewhere I had not expected. I am going to tell you about it now, but first you need to understand what I had been carrying for nearly 4 months by the time I found it. The slow, exhausting uncertainty of not knowing whether any of this would matter, whether I would ultimately lose the only home I had ever known, despite everything I had built there. Robert Pruitt, the estate attorney, called me one afternoon in early summer, several months into this process, and told me he had something he thought I should see. He explained somewhat carefully that in going through my father's complete file, including older documents that predated the updated will Curtis had referenced, he had found a separate letter, handwritten, dated almost exactly 12 years earlier, just 2 weeks after that Sunday dinner at the kitchen table. The letter had apparently been placed in my father's file as a kind of personal memorandum, not a formal legal document, but a written record of his thinking at the time. Robert read portions of it to me over the phone, and I asked him to send me a copy immediately. In that letter, my father had written, in his own careful handwriting, that he intended for Walter to inherit the farm, given his demonstrated commitment to the land and the family legacy it represented, that this was his clear intention as of that date, and that he hoped any future updates to his formal estate documents would reflect this understanding, unless circumstances changed substantially. The letter was dated, signed, and notarized, a detail that struck me as unusual for what was otherwise an informal personal memorandum, until Robert explained that my father had apparently brought the letter to a notary, specifically because he wanted, in his own words, as recorded in a brief cover note Robert also found, to make sure there was no question later about what he had truly intended, regardless of whatever happened with the formal will over time. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter in front of me for a long time after Robert sent it. I thought about my father, in the weeks after that Sunday dinner, taking the time, on his own, without telling any of us, to formalize his intentions in a way that went beyond a simple verbal promise at a family meal. I thought about why he might have done that, and the answer that made the most sense to me, the answer I came to believe over the following months as more pieces of this story emerged, was that some part of my father had perhaps sensed, even then, that Curtis might eventually push back against an arrangement that left him with nothing beyond what he felt entitled to as a son. And my father had wanted some additional protection in place for the arrangement he believed was genuinely fair. What this letter meant practically was significant. It did not automatically overturn the formal will, which remained the controlling legal document on its face. But it provided exactly the kind of documented, contemporaneous evidence of my father's original intent that Sandra had told me would be crucial to any promissory estoppel claim, evidence that existed independently of my own testimony about that kitchen table conversation, evidence with a notary's seal and a clear date that could not easily be dismissed as a self-serving recollection. I am going to tell you what happened when I shared this letter with Curtis and Donna, because the confrontation that followed taught me something important about both of my siblings that I had not fully understood before. I requested a meeting at Sandra's office, with Curtis and Donna both present along with their own legal counsel, which Curtis had retained almost immediately after the initial will reading. I want to describe the room that day, because I remember it clearly. It was a conference room with a long table and tall windows looking out over a parking lot, and I remember the particular quality of the early afternoon light coming through those windows as Sandra laid out the documentation. The tax records, the equipment financing, my father's letters to his brother, and finally, the notarized memorandum Robert Pruitt had discovered. I had not seen Curtis since the will reading itself, nearly 4 months earlier, and I remember being struck, when he walked into that conference room, by how much older he looked, a tiredness around his eyes that I did not remember from the funeral. He nodded at me stiffly as he sat down across the table, and Donna, beside him, gave me a small, uncertain smile that told me she was not entirely comfortable with where this meeting was heading. Sandra began by laying out the financial documentation first, the tax filings, the equipment receipts, walking Curtis's attorney through each piece methodically. Curtis's attorney, a younger man named Phillips who I did not know, asked several pointed questions about whether this financial evidence alone was sufficient to override a clearly drafted will, questions that Sandra answered carefully, acknowledging that the financial documentation alone might not have been enough, which was precisely why the next piece of evidence mattered so much. I watched Curtis's face as Sandra slid copies of our father's letters to his brother across the table, the letters in which our father had written, in his own hand, that the farm would stay with Walter and his family. Curtis read through them slowly, his jaw tightening, and when he looked up, he said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound reasonable, that personal letters to a brother were not the same as a formal legal document, that people said all kinds of things in private correspondence that did not necessarily reflect their final, considered decisions. It was at that point that Sandra produced the notarized memorandum. I watched something in Curtis genuinely deflate as he read it, the formal seal at the bottom of the page, making clear that this was not simply my word against his, nor a private letter that could be dismissed as casual sentiment. He set the document down on the table and was quiet for a long moment. Donna, beside him, read the same documents with an expression that I would describe as something closer to discomfort than surprise, and I came to understand, in the conversation that followed, that Donna had genuinely not been as actively involved in Curtis's push for equal division as I had initially assumed, that she had largely deferred to Curtis's framing of the situation, without examining it closely herself, perhaps out of her own distance from the farm and a desire to avoid family conflict rather than any genuine belief that I deserved nothing for my decades of work. Curtis finally spoke again, his voice tighter now, and said that even if our father had felt that way 12 years ago, people's changed their minds, that the later will was the document that legally mattered, and that he did not see why he should simply step aside from what he considered his fair third of an inheritance based on old letters and sentiment. I did not raise my voice when I responded. I want you to understand that about me, the same patience that had carried me through 3 decades of difficult mornings and unpredictable weather carried me through that conversation as well. I simply said, calmly, that I had spent 29 years building a life around an explicit promise our father had made. A promise he had cared enough about to formalize in writing without telling any of us, and that I was prepared to pursue this matter through whatever legal process was necessary to honor what I genuinely believed, and now could document our father had actually wanted. I said I did not want a war with my own siblings. I said I was open to a reasonable resolution that acknowledged the reality of what had happened over those 12 years, but that I was not willing to simply walk away from the only home I had ever known, based on a will that I now had strong evidence did not reflect our father's true and consistent intentions. There was a long silence after I said this, the kind of silence that sits heavily in a room with tall windows and a long table, nobody quite willing to be the first to speak. Curtis looked down at the documents in front of him, then back up at me, and for just a moment, before his expression hardened back into something more guarded, I saw something that looked almost like the boy I remembered from childhood, the one who used to follow me out to the barn. Before either of us understood what the farm would eventually come to mean for our relationship, Curtis's attorney asked for time to review the documentation more thoroughly. That review took another 6 weeks, during which I continued, as I had every single day for nearly 30 years, to work that land, to feed the cattle, to manage the daily operations of a farm whose ultimate ownership remained legally uncertain. A strange and exhausting period of limbo that I do not think anyone fully understands unless they have lived through something similar themselves. What happened next, after those 6 weeks, was not the dramatic courtroom victory you might be expecting if you have watched stories like this before. It was something quieter, and in its own way, more meaningful. Curtis's attorney contacted Sandra with a proposed settlement. Rather than pursuing what would likely have been a lengthy and expensive legal battle, With an uncertain outcome for both sides, Curtis and Donna would agree to transfer the farm property entirely to me, formally and completely, acknowledging the documented history of my father's original and consistent intent. In exchange, I would provide both of my siblings with a financial settlement, drawn from a life insurance policy my father had maintained separately from the farm itself, a policy whose proceeds had originally been intended to be split 3 ways, but which I now agreed to restructure, giving Curtis and Donna a larger combined share of those funds, in exchange for their full and complete relinquishment of any claim to the land itself. I want to be honest with you about how I felt when Sandra called to tell me Curtis had agreed to this proposal. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, mostly, a kind of profound exhaustion, the particular tiredness that comes after carrying genuine uncertainty for the better part of a year, finally allowed to set that weight down. I also felt something more complicated when I thought about Curtis, specifically, a sadness that our relationship had come to this, that it had required notarized documents and attorneys and 6 months to arrive at an outcome that I genuinely believed our father had always intended, plainly and simply. From that very first conversation at the kitchen table 12 years earlier, the settlement was finalized on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, almost exactly 1 year after my father's death. I signed the final documents at Sandra's office, and when I walked out into the parking lot afterward, the air had that particular sharp clarity that comes with the first real cold snap of the season. And I stood by my truck for a long moment, looking out at nothing in particular, simply breathing. I drove straight from that office back to the farm, the same drive I had made thousands of times over 30 years, and when I pulled into the driveway, the farmhouse sitting on its rise above the lower field exactly as it had. For over 70 years, I felt something settle in my chest that I had not fully realized was still unsettled. Susan was waiting on the porch, and she did not ask me how it had gone. She could see it in my face, and she simply put her arms around me and we stood there together for a while, watching the last of the daylight move across the fields. Eli and Grace came running out a few minutes later, having heard the truck in the driveway, and Grace, who was 11 that year, asked me directly whether the farm was officially ours now. In the blunt way children ask the questions adults dance around. I told her yes, and I watched her face light up with a relief that told me she had been carrying more worry about this entire process than I had realized. More than I think either Susan or I had fully understood a child her age could absorb from the tense conversations happening around her over that long year. I want to tell you about the weeks immediately following the settlement, because I think the quiet, unremarkable nature of those weeks mattered to me more than any dramatic resolution could have. I went back to the same routine I had followed for nearly 30 years, up before dawn, checking the herd, working whatever the season required, and there was something almost overwhelming in those first weeks about doing that same work with the formal, legal certainty that it was unambiguously mine, that no future challenge could once again threaten to take it away. I remember standing in the lower field one cold morning in November, frost still on the ground, watching the sun come up over the tree line, and feeling a kind of peace that I had not realized. Until that moment, I had been missing for the entire previous year. I want to tell you about my relationship with Curtis and Donna now, in the time since that settlement, because I think it matters for understanding the full shape of this story rather than just its most dramatic moments. Donna and I have rebuilt something close to a genuine relationship over the past 2 years, careful and still occasionally awkward but real. She visits more often than she used to, bringing her husband out to the farm for Sunday dinners every few months, something that had not happened with any regularity in years before all of this began. I think the entire experience, uncomfortable as it was for her, made her examine her own tendency to defer to Curtis's version of events rather than thinking through situations independently. A pattern, she has told me, in quieter moments on the porch after dinner, she is trying to be more conscious of going forward. She told me once, sitting out there in the early evening with a glass of tea, that she had spent so many years assuming Curtis's read on family situations was simply correct, a habit left over from childhood roles none of us had ever really examined, and that watching the documentation lay out so clearly in that conference room had been the first time she had ever seriously questioned that assumption. Curtis and I have a more distant relationship now, polite at family gatherings, exchanging holiday calls, but without the easy warmth that might have existed if things had unfolded differently. I saw him last at a cousin's wedding about 8 months ago, and our conversation was brief and civil, focused mostly on neutral subjects: the weather, the kids. Nothing that touched on the farm or the year we had spent on opposite sides of a legal dispute. I do not know if that distance will ever fully close. I have made peace with the possibility that it might not, though I will say that some part of me still hopes, with time, we might find our way back to something more like what we had as boys, before land and money and old unspoken resentments came to define so much of what stood between us. I think about my father often when I am out working the fields now, the same fields he worked as a younger man, the same fields his own father cleared and planted decades before I was born. I think about that notarized letter, written quietly and privately 12 years ago without any of us knowing, a small act of foresight and care that ultimately protected everything I had built. I think sometimes about how strange it is that the truth of a person's deepest intentions can sit folded in a filing cabinet for over a decade, waiting patiently for the moment it is finally needed. The way my father's careful handwriting waited in that drawer, through 12 years of seasons, through his own declining health, through his death, until it finally found its way into Robert Pruitt's hands and from there into mine. If someone in your life made you a promise that mattered, a promise you built years of your own life around, and then watched someone else try to rewrite that promise, after the person who made it could no longer speak for themselves, I think you understand exactly what I am describing. I want you to know that hard work and quiet patience are not naive virtues, even when it feels, in the middle of the struggle, like they might not be enough. Sometimes the proof you need has already been written down somewhere, by someone who loved you enough to make sure the truth would outlast any attempt to bury it. Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one.